Hey there YouTube, welcome back to King's Court. I am Shrine King, and today we're going to do kind of like an intro guide for Path of Exile, answer a couple questions or give some guidelines that might assist or help a player who is looking to get started in Path of Exile and maybe just doesn't know where to go or what they could do to make sure that the experience in the game is really good. On top of that, in the end of this, I will kind of cover a build that I'm currently running that I would recommend for any player that's looking, especially like for first-time players, because the build's pretty straightforward, it's pretty easy to run, and it will get you through a lot of game content. So, to get started, we are looking at Path of Exile. What can I do, and what should I do to maybe get started, or even what is Path of Exile? Let's start there. So, Path of Exile is an action RPG that is much like Diablo. It will have a storyline, you'll have a character, and you'll have quests and experience gain, levels, and stat points, along with gear and equipment. Endgame is typically very focused on farming for gear and equipment so that you can continuously progress through endgame material. Now, if that is something that sounds enjoyable or something that you would like to do, along with maybe even just going through a story, this is definitely a game that is an option for you. But to make that experience really enjoyable, because even trying to get through the story can be a little difficult in this game, mainly because of how character builds are designed and mechanics in the game that relate. So, to get started, the real trick here is identifying what kind of person are you and what do you normally like to do in games. So if you've played role-playing games before, the question is like, what really seemed to fit to you? Do you like being at range, or do you like being in close combat? Do you like being a tank, or do you like being a damage dealer? Do you like utilities such as like teleportations and like crowd control components such as like sleep or freezing, or charming, so on and so forth. Now, while not all of those components really exist in the game, there are quite a few that do. So once you kind of answered those questions, that's just the beginning point for you. When it comes to this game in particular, there is a lot to consider in one, who you run as, and two, how do you build for that character and gear that character towards a certain structure that you're aiming for, which is one of the main reasons why I highly recommend that once you've kind of identified what kind of playstyle you're really looking for, that you then go to like a PoE Path of Exile Wikipedia to look at active skill gems. And the reason being is, so in this game, rather than me picking like a Templar and then I say, oh, well, yes, I get these certain skills and abilities, and as I level, those abilities change and so on and so forth, this game is actually focused on what they call gems. And those gems are socketable into equipment. And by socketing it into the equipment, you then have said ability. So the reality of it comes down to, rather than focusing simply on the character that you want, so it's like saying, oh, I want a Templar or a Scion or a Ranger, you actually want to focus on what model you're really looking for. Do you want to be ranged? Do you want to be close combat? Are you looking to do elemental damage? Or are you looking to do physical damage? Are you wanting to be poison? Or do you want to do like chaos, because chaos is considered different than elemental damage in this, but it's still like an element type in a way. So there's all these considerations for that. But the real trick to that, to me, honestly, that I would recommend is, if you, for example, say that you want to be close combat, I would look at red or green gems of the active skills and look through those active skills and see if there's one that kind of makes you feel like, hey, that sounds really cool, or that sounds really like something I would be interested in. And then you can look up like videos of that ability to see what that ability really does. once you've kind of identified what ability you're looking for to play with, then you would look up builds that people have made based on that ability. The reason why I recommend looking up those builds is because there is so much mathematics to consider. There are also hidden components in the game off of gear, or even certain item, a lot of items. There's hidden components to it that don't necessarily show up, that you just have to have figured out just through interaction in the game, or through a guide or some information that people have given out. So there's all sorts of stuff there. And not only that, but typically the stuff that's posted is something that works, so it at least gives you a basis of where to start. It doesn't mean that you have to stick to said model or anything like that. It just means this current design worked really well for somebody for a certain purpose. And usually when it comes to those builds, they not only tell you at what levels to spec for certain things, what gear that you're really looking for, how to go about it. They also list pros and cons to say, like, hey, this is really what this is focused for, or hey, there's a certain restriction to this based on said thing. So with that's highly what I recommend to start with. So for example, in my case, the build I went with is a totem build, and the recommendation, while there can be multiple classes or ones to pick, I actually picked the Templar, which is this guy here on the left, and then he has certain spec points that are allowed, that allow me to get extra totems, so that way for the totem build I'm not stuck to one totem, because there's mechanics in the game, like for example, starting out, unless you have something to boost it, you only are allowed one totem. Even in the skill tree, there's only one extra totem placement, besides I think another, like the Marauder, I think you can also get it, so there's maybe 3 at total out of the tree, which I'll get into showing that tree and why it's really kind of a big deal for looking into these builds. So that build, like, I followed most of what the person said there because of my experience in the game. Rather than me sticking to a Glacial Cascade spell, I went with Freezing Pulse because I really enjoyed how the Freezing Pulse had control of the environment and the way that it interacted, and that there's some jewels that I could run that allow me to get multiple projectiles off of it, which made it pretty interesting. So when you go to pick out, like you'd start out, things to note is incursion, like this is a league. A league is much just the same as in Diablo, so there are certain leagues that are going during certain times. When you go through the league, you actually typically get certain in-game items as a reward for accomplishing certain things. You can also choose standard mode, which then it's just the base of the game. Hardcore mode is for those that really want a significant challenge. Now I want to bear in mind, for anyone starting out, this game is a little difficult on its own. Much different than other action RPGs I've played. So I do not recommend playing hardcore mode, at least starting out, until you have a good grip of how this game works and how certain builds work and what to kind of expect. Then I would say it's probably at that point, if you're looking for an extra challenge, hardcore mode would be for you. But when you pick out your league, then you actually have to pick out who you want to play. Now again, if you've already looked up a build, which is what I highly recommend, you would already know who you need to pick, because not only is there the class here, but each one of these classes has 3 ascendancy classes, so it's kind of like special classes or prestige classes. And each one of those prestige classes has different capabilities or functionality that should be considered for your endgame build. So while you can easily go through the game, probably acts 1 through 5, just picking out whatever and going, when it starts coming to the other acts, so there's acts 6 through 10, which is still part of the story, you'll start running into significant problems, most likely, if you don't have a good planned build. Also noting like what gear to look for and so on and so forth. And the end game stuff, like, which is past tier 10, I almost guarantee you in most cases people will definitely struggle or not be able to complete any end game if they have no real planned build. So with that said, that's really where I want to leave that at. Like each one has its kind of like special trait that they normally go with, but there's a key reason why I'm saying like it's more important about identifying the skill and the build. So just to show that, I'm going to go ahead and launch into the player that I have, which in my case I built a Templar. And the reason being is because of the Hierophant specialization, right? So this is the Ascendancy. So in here, like I said, I'm doing a totem build. So like you'll see on this path, it says I get extra totem placement speed, mana regeneration rate, but then Pursuit of Faith says now I have 100% increased totem duration. I'm also allowed to have an additional totem summoned at a time. And then I get damage boost and attack speed boost for having the totems. Then I keep going into this part, which then goes into Ritual of Awakening, which then says I can have another totem. So just by having this alone, I would actually be able to place 3 totems. But as I mentioned, there are other things to consider where there's actually skill that I can get to get another one. And then you'll see here that it's giving me regen per totem that I have placed, and then again increasing the totem placement speed. Now, the main reason why I mentioned planning. So here is the start location of a Templar. And then I'm going to blow this out. This is the skill tree. So you'll see it is a big circle. Anyone who's played like Final Fantasy X would kind of recognize this kind of model because it was the same model that they had, and which is funny because they do have a design that's very similar in this sense. So even though I am a Templar, and I'm putting like this area of stuff is focused on a Templar, there are other start locations which are blocked out right here. So this is saying this is not my start location. But this is actually the Marauder, if I remember right. And then you have different ones from all the way around. Like this top one is actually a Witch. So you'll see I actually go into Templar and then move over into Witch, which then I come even farther over, and this gets into Duelist, I believe. It's either Duelist or Assassin, I can't remember offhand. So then from here, right, this is why I'm saying planning is really, really important, because every point counts and how it's placed, when it's placed, so on and so forth. So for example, I mentioned like I was able to get an extra totem, so that's this particular portion. But for this build, I actually can plant 5 totems, and it's because not all stuff is derivative by your skill or class. So for example, I have a chest piece that says I can have an additional totem summoned at one time, so that gets me up to 5. This is where I was mentioning, not only is it who you picked, how you spec it, what you specialize with it, but then also what is the gear you're using. This all takes effect into what that build can do. So that's why it's very, very important that you plan out how you want to do that. Now, if you are very adamant about I don't want to run anyone else's build, period, then that is totally fine. I totally understand. What I do recommend then is that you use things for planning. And there's PoE Planner. That is it's a web-based application, so you just use your computer with internet access. Go to actually you can just Google PoE Planner and it'll take you right to the link for it. And then you can pick like what you're thinking of trying, and you can do just about anything on there. So like you can spec out like these points, like all these skill points. You can spec all that out. You can even put in your equipment. And you can pick your ascendancy, right? So that's like the specialization, and that'll give you a good gist of like what you can expect out of that, like what kind of boosting of damage, what kind of boosting of health, stuff like that. The part that gets a little iffy is really relating to how DPS is working and what's your effective damage overall while in combat, while things are cursed, and all these other components. If you're looking for a little bit of a more in-depth planner, I highly recommend actually going to get Path of Building. Most builds will actually reference a Path of Building link, So because I'm recommending this particular build for people starting out, because honestly from going from scratch all the way up, which I'm currently running like tier 10, tier 11 maps, this build is very viable, very strong. I didn't really have too many problems whatsoever, so I definitely do highly recommend it for a first-time player. So I'm going to have a link, I got to figure out how to do it, but I'm going to have a link for the path of building. For this particular one, I will also link the URL for where I pulled the original build out of. So the original build was for Glacial Cascade. The only thing I really changed is I made this one focus on freezing pulse, which then required me to adjust a couple points because it doesn't really make sense in this build's case, because I'm not physical damage or AoE based. I'm more cold damage and projectile damage based. So if you're really looking into getting started, I do highly recommend these things. Path of building, you can look it up again by by Google, and it'll get you a link directly to there, which then you can download. It's very easy to set up and install. And if you guys are having any trouble trying to figure that out, please, by all means, leave a comment. I'll leave like maybe a better instructional guide on how to do that. I might even make a video on just how to install that component. But again, like if you are planning on starting out, I do highly recommend that you go through that part. Besides all of that, some things to bear in mind that's different in this game is that you actually, everything that you find, there is no real currency. So for example, if I go to sell, you'll see in here it's just like, okay, well, yeah, what are you selling, right? And I could say, hey, I want to sell this. And you'll see here, okay, well, it's just going to give me a list of stuff. There's no actual money, there's no silver, there's no gold, nothing like that. That's because everything in this game is actually a usable component. And that's how all trade works. So currency is actually stuff that is equally used in the game. So for example, an Orb of Alchemy, which says I can upgrade a normal item to a rare item, is currency in the game, which means I can either use it, spending currency to achieve said thing, such as upgrading a normal item, or I can use said currency to trade to get certain things. So if you're looking to buy items, and you're like, I really need like a certain unique item that I can't see, like for example, let's say these surge binders. I really am trying to find surge binders or some kind of unique gauntlet. Anytime you're trying to look at doing actual trade or finding stuff to buy, there's not really vendors to buy uniques, and even the rares that you find on them are pretty lacking. So there is a site called poe.trade. So if you type in PoE trade in Google, that'll get you there too. poe.trade is actually the website, so if you type that in the URL, that should get you there as well. You can actually specify what you're looking for off of there, and that'll tell you what people are posting and what its current prices are. So they can widely range. It all depends on what's kind of in the flavor of this season, and then also it helps you choose kind of like, hey, I'm looking for particular sockets or I'm looking for particular stats, and you can kind of compare and make sure that you're getting the best of what you can at that time for said trade value.
May your maps be merciful.
If trying to give a understanding or reason to why this build is one of the reasons why I'm highly recommending it, so as I mentioned before, like endgame components are based on maps. So like once you've kind of gone through the entire, so you'll see here part 1, there are 5 main acts. You have a part 2, which is another 5 main acts. And then you're finally in epilogue, and when you get into epilogue, they actually start instructing you through doing maps, which you'll get like this little map device, and you'll have options of running maps, and that goes off the atlas. So here you'll see this is my atlas, and then we actually have a bunch of maps here, which for you it'll start off with the 4 top corners. So here we'll see we have 4 corners, and these are all tier 1 maps. So in my case, I actually easily run any of these. I don't really have any problem running them. So what I'll do is, let's say, sure, like I'll start with a 6. I'm just going to pick a random one. On the same sense, I'm actually going to upgrade it, so now it's even, which that's the part I was talking about, like you can use said currency, it says upgrade normal to rare, and that was a map, which was a normal, and I just upgraded it to rare. So one thing to note for the end game is when you do this, usually as you're making it rare or magical and things like that, you'll see it actually gives detrimental effects, but also could also have some benefits. So like you see the item quantity, item rarity, all of that increase, but now I have reduced flash charges, and the monsters can avoid bleeding blind and stuff like that. But the reason why this build is pretty cool is that when running stuff like this, I really just kill everything so fast without me even really having to do much. So that was like a unique guy, right? So he's a little bit tougher. And then there are things in the game, so like for example, bam. So like there's just real quick things like this you can find that are kind of special. These are breaches, so they actually summon like weird monsters to the realm. So the goal here is to keep killing them. They drop like essences or splinters, so this is a splinter to drop. So you'll see here, just going around planting totems. They really take care of my work. I don't really have to do too much. This is pretty simple. The real gist of what I'm doing is just keeping it going, and, staying alive, and making sure to keep planting totems. You'll see, it even told me, hey, I had a gem that level. So, yeah, and this, like I said, this design, what I'm able to do, and you saw how quickly I'm able to kill things, this goes on and on. Like, I can do much higher tiers than this. The bosses don't really take that long. And that's why I highly recommend it, because it's overall survivability. But, sadly, my headset is actually running out of battery, so I'm going to have to cut this a little short. So again, I will put in the links to reference for this. If you are looking to get started, absolutely please go ahead and get started. If you like these kind of videos, if you like the information I'm giving, please feel free to like the video, subscribe, and then I'm always trying to post stuff. I do have things going on in life that tend to make it where I'm not as consistent, but I do try to at least post once a week. And I'm going to, in some cases, I will actually post numerous times a week, as I am playing multiple games. Right now, Path of Exile, because of the incursion, it's been one of my primary focuses. So I will be making a couple more videos oriented towards endgame content, and kind of like my review of the incursion season or league, because every league they kind of do new content with it. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Please feel free to leave me any comments or questions that you have, and I will absolutely try to build more content oriented towards those, or at least answer those questions that you have.